In Chapter 4, we are going to begin talking about the cops, our first component of the criminal justice system. And we're going to start with the history. Where else, right? The history of the police. Not surprising, today U.S. police and policing is under a microscope. The last few months have obviously really put them under a microscope, but this has been ongoing. And the goal is to ensure that past mistakes are not repeated and that some forward momentum can be reached. It is this reason that we need to explore the history and the foundations that the American policing system was built on. The police are the gatekeepers of the criminal justice system, or the criminal justice process. They're the first to encounter or have contact with the victim, but more importantly, the violator. They're the first to have contact with the violator. They also decide when and whether an arrest is going to be made. Sometimes they'll consult with a DA, prosecutor, but it is the job of the police to charge an arrest. They also can just give a warning, use some discretion, or determine that no charge or no action is required. And this gives them great power. And now they're even more, as I said, in the forefront with visibility and contact with the public. Social media has certainly given rise to police conduct and the rise of being able to videotape them in response to what has been happening. States are quickly responding. New York, for example, the governor, our legislators, our New York State legislators, and ultimately the governor had passed several laws in response to what has occurred in the recent months involving police. Sadly, the governor had to actually pass a law that said that the public can record law enforcement in public and doing their job as long as they don't interfere. We've always had that right. That's a constitutional right. It's a First Amendment right to videotape the government in public. However, police officers and firefighters and some other of our public folks don't like that. So they would certainly bully and say things like, put your camera away or I'm going to arrest you. Or you can't be here filming that. Yeah, you could, as long as you're not interfering. And now the governor has actually passed a law that says we have the right to film police in public. The governor has also passed a number of laws that said they're no longer allowed to use excessive force or deadly force. We'll talk more about that. He passed some laws that ban chokeholds, that he's deemed the attorney general, the independent prosecutor in killings of unarmed civilians by police. Initially, that was the job of the individual prosecutors of that particular area or county, and you could see that there was certainly some problems that could arise because law enforcement is the ones who do the job in the arrest, and they have to go to that prosecutor. You could see that there could be some potential conflict. Freedom of information rules have been lax. There used to be an exception where the public could not get background information on police officers. It was protected. Now it's allowed under freedom of information in the state of New York, that is. So there has been some legislative response to the recent police conduct, but certainly as we go through this history of the police, we may determine that there should be more action taken. So, without further ado, as with our criminal laws, i.e. our common laws, the origins of police can be traced back to England. In the ancient times, we'll say 1066, the years we're going to go back here, the year we're going to go back to, there was no official police. There was no official English police. Villages had to fend for themselves. What they did was they responded to their neighbors. They would, the responsibility was the neighbors aiding each other, and they called that the pledge system. These neighbors of groups were called tithings, and they took care of minor issues. Bigger issues were handled by someone they called the constable, who was appointed and kind of oversaw the tithings and their conduct. In the 1300s, or the 1300th century, the 13th, let's call it the 13th century, the watch system was implemented. And this was to help protect the English larger cities. And under this watch system, watchmen patrolled and protected against various crimes. The watchmen made up of church parish members, and they also reported to a constable. In 1829, Sir Robert Peel, that was England's Home Secretary, he established the first public police, and they were referred to as the doctrine that was published that oversaw this was the Metropolitan Police Act, and they created the first British police force, which was and is structured along the lines of like the military organization. And this is also the system as what we know now here in the 21st century as the modern police system. This is kind of what our U.S. system stems from. And the police back then were called boobies, but they had issues, corruption, alcoholism. They weren't particularly stopping crime. They were involved in crime themselves. So they certainly weren't effective. And then we get to colonial America. And like I said, the system paralleled the British model. And our version of a constable was a county sheriff, also the peacekeeper. Every time I think of that, I think of the movie Tombstone. I don't know, it might be a little too old for you guys, but Wyatt Earp and the sheriff guy. He handles county matters, not town matters. Anyway, county sheriff did not patrol and did not seek out crime. He was a politician type. And he would react basically to citizens' complaints, and he might do some investigating. And then the cities had marshals, and the marshals had deputies. Think of Wyatt Earp. He was deemed a marshal from the county sheriff, and then he deputized his two brothers and his friend Doc Holliday. And I like to use that as an example because that just gives the best view of our early American times. But of course, they had a hard time. I had a hard time enforcing laws. Also in the South had slave patrols, and their job was to recapture slaves that escaped from their owners. And these slave patrols administered justice right on the spot. And you can imagine what that was. Most of the time it was whipping or death or hanging. In the West, there was, at this time, was the gold rush out in the West. And amidst all of that, they had vigilance committees that were made up of citizens. And the one in San Francisco was very active, and they actively pursued criminals and administered justice, quote unquote, right on the spot. And sometimes they would just take the word of a snitch. And most of the time those snitches were saving their butts for something that they did. So there wasn't a whole lot of, let's call it, due process or fairness in a justice system. And then in Boston. Yep, Boston created the first formal U.S. police department, followed by New York City, and then Philadelphia. And I'm going to note here that there's an attachment in the additional materials section on Moodle, a New York Times article, or actually it was an article from Time Magazine about the history of the police. I think it's an excellent supplement to what we're discussing right now, if you wanted to take a look at that, and I hope you do. And these folks, these police departments, replaced the night watchman system that was being used in those cities at the time. But again, it was met with, there was corruption, they were brutal, they were inefficient, they were incompetent, because in order to get one of these gigs, you had to have some political clout. And most people wanted to be a policeman because it paid more than any other job. But there was no training, and they often conflicted with the public. And their main role was to just maintain law and order. As you can see, things could get brutal that way if that was their only job, was to maintain law and order, and there was nobody to check their actions. The early part of the 19th century, this was, as you can imagine, early part of the 18th century was a very primitive policing system. There was no cars. They were patrolled on foot. There was no backup. Definitely no fingerprinting or radios or bookkeeping to keep track of things. But by the middle of the 19th century, a telegraph system was available for communicating with each other. Police officers began using bicycles for patrolling. Police wagons were established. You can use a wagon with a horse pulling. And the problem was that politicians were the ones that were controlling law enforcement. And a lot was as a result of politicians controlling law enforcement. It was hard for law enforcement to be effective because they were guided by politics. I might be a little ahead on my slides. So we got the telegraph, we got the bicycles, and motorized bicycles. They call, I don't think of our version of a motorcycle, more of like a motorized bicycle. And then the wagons came, and more motorized vehicles. So after the Civil War, agencies began to focus more on crime versus maintaining law and order. And out of this, as we turn to the 20th century, now there was efforts to reduce corruption. Police administration boards were created to reduce political control. So these administration boards handled police affairs, not politicians. But some of the problems with that was these board members were inexperienced. They were members of the public, and they had no idea of police work. And then police departments began to organize and establish unions. In Boston, there was the Boston Social Club. That was the first union, police union. It's still around today. It's a member of the American Federation of Labor. And they went on strike, and riots broke out, and the president had to step in. And after the riots, lawmakers began to investigate crime and the ability of the justice system to deal with it effectively. So, the president is stepping in, and this comes after the Great Depression. Let's talk about the Great Depression here. The Depression comes in 1920, And any ideas of the lawmakers to begin investigating crime and the justice system kind of gets tossed to the wayside. And at that time, national leaders formed the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the IACP, to help improve and professionalize the police. And this organization is still around today. And at that time, they called for creating civil service police force and for removing political influence and control altogether. And they implemented training programs. Finally, our police officers are getting some training. And Los Angeles was the first department to train their police officers. And in the 1960s, this was a big decade for police and reform. The Supreme Court handed down a number of decisions designed to control police operations and procedures. That basically that entire decade, we had some very big cases, and we're going to talk about those in the upcoming chapters. Miranda was one. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you can say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one, one will be appointed to you. Those rights, that's what came out of the 1960s, along with being the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure. The police need probable cause to subject somebody to a search and seizure of property. Wiretapping. Police just cannot wiretap communications that they were using at telephones at that time without probable cause or a warrant. So a lot of rights came down in the 1960s. Of course, there was the civil rights movement and policies and regarding police treatment of African Americans at that point. I know we're still dealing with that today. This all begins in the 60s. Riots are occurring throughout major cities. We have the Vietnam War that starts at the tail end of the 60s into the early 70s, and we have student protests, and they bunk heads with the police. And at this point, crime is rising. It's doubling in the 1960s. In the 1970s, agency structure starts to change. The federal government gave support to local police through funding through the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the LEAA, for agencies, training and education programs. There was money for college campuses to educate students who seek to work in law enforcement, then money for technology advances. This organization, the LEAA, kind of died in the 1980s, but really what happened, it was placed under a different department in the federal government, so it is still around. I put a link to it on Moodle for your review. The 1980s, agencies were changing. They were out of the crime fighter role to a more community policing concept. And this is from 1980 to 2000. The police determined that they couldn't act alone. We couldn't do this policing thing on our own. We need to have the community pitch in and help. The issues that developed, as this is the police's claim, the police were claiming, the issues that developed didn't happen overnight, and we're not going to be able to solve it overnight, and we're not going to be able to solve it solely by policing. The issues have to be solved systematically. So this starts, the 80s through the 2000s. Officers were showing up, now on the job, having college educations, and the problem-oriented policing began to take some shape, and it was time for research on crime, on police, and on the criminal justice system as a whole. But then the Reagan administration steps in and begins to cut budgets. And in the 1990s, what do we see? We see the Rodney King beating, which is filmed on TV. And the police officers are put on trial. This is in Los Angeles. The police officers are put on trial, and jury finds them not guilty. That creates riots in Los Angeles, and what prompts in the early 90s is an era of reform. And as you are probably thinking, isn't that what we're still dealing with now? Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely what we're dealing with now. But there have been some achievements. In the 1990s, there was an increase in intellectual capacity, meaning educated people, people coming from college into law enforcement. There was advanced management techniques. The standards of police conduct began to improve, probably through training. More diverse police departments. There was certainly more minorities and females joining the police department when it was primarily white men. The police work took on a more intellectually challenging concept in the 90s when it involved the community and more of a problem solving. We'll talk about these things in a little bit more detail. This is an overview. Problem solving aspects of crime. And gradually, citizens began to accept the police again. There is another area I want to talk about. It's not in the book, but I want to talk about. So what I want to talk about, not in the book, is Homeland Security. And that's the era of I'm going to tie it in with 2001 to the present day. September 11th, 2001. I'm sure you're all aware of what happened. Terrorists hijacked planes, flew them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and one plane crashed over Pennsylvania. In response, was the federal government's response was to create Homeland Security. And this is found in our Patriots Act. And Homeland Security created Border Patrol. Border Patrol didn't exist until now in the fashion that it exists. And their duties are well expanded. Their first mission is the dissemination of information and communications. One of the central problems was communicating between the various law enforcement agencies. When 9/11 happened, couldn't communicate with each other. There was no way. It was just very chaotic, and the law enforcement agents, the various different ones, trying to communicate with each other. So the first line of business at Homeland Security was to fix that issue. And now we have this Border Patrol, and it kind of begged the question of, should we have a national police department? The United States doesn't have a national police department. Canada has a national police department. But should there be? As of now, Border Patrol patrols close to our borders. And I say close to our borders. They have a 100-mile radius. And one of their abilities is they are allowed to stop any vehicle without any sort of probable cause or reason if the vehicle is traveling within 100 miles of a border. And after 9/11, that was happening a lot. Actually, right after President Trump was elected. If you lived in the North Country, that was happening a lot. You couldn't drive down the interstate without there being a roadblock where you had to stop, roll down your window, and be asked what's your nationality, what country were you born, or what country you're born in, one of the other questions. Border Patrol is free to do that. That was one of their abilities. In 2014, President Obama signed an executive order creating the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. The task force submitted its position and offered recommendations on identifying important priorities for modern policing, which included all of those things right there on the screen: building trust and legitimacy, policy over insight, technology and social media, community policing and crime reduction, training and education, officer well-being, and safety. We are going to expand on a lot of these things. And the question becomes, this is a executive order created by the president. The question becomes, who does this apply? Federal? Just the federal folks? Border Patrol, FBI, Secret Service? It applies to each local law enforcement agency. They have their own, each of them have their own training system, and they each have to implement these 6 specific areas. Our village, but while they each have their own training system, it's not created equal. Our village police and our city police are trained differently than our New York State troopers. And the university campus police are trained state troopers. They're trained alongside the state troopers, or with the state troopers. They're considered state troopers. The federal police forces are trained elsewhere, and the levels are quite different. What's expected is quite different. Where are we today? 6 years later? If I did my math, I did my math right. 6 years later. Are we any different? Are we influenced by anything? Things changed? Do you think the general public has greater respect for police today than in the past? I'm not even going to attempt to answer those questions. You got to be thinking about them. Think about what you see. Think about what you know. Maybe you're related to police officers. I'm related to police officers. I've worked with police officers. I know what they have to see day in and day out, and what their job entails day in and day out. Not saying that's an excuse one way or the other, but some folks who are more subject to it than what we see on what's presented on social media. Where do we go? Are there any problems faced by today's law enforcement that were also present during early policing days from what you read and what we talked about? Sure there is, right? We've always, not just what we see with their attacks on civilians who are unarmed, just in general, there's some bad seeds who still do things. Was a police officer in the last 4 years? Was it 4 years? Time goes by awfully quick. But there was a local New York State trooper who was on trial for 4 different rapes. They're human beings too. So, anyhow, I'm digressing. I have lots of stories I could share. So from here, where we're going to go is we are going to, actually I want to talk, I think I got one more slide here. Policing and law enforcement today. Okay, so more user-friendly, in quotations. Should there be a defunding of the police, is what's been at least put out there in the media? Should we decentralize police departments? Should they be more responsive to community needs? Are we adapting to new forms of criminal behavior? There's always new laws coming up. We already talked about that. Should there just be one police force, or should law enforcement be distributed across the board? Local, county, state, federal? Should we have them broken up in jurisdictions? Federal law enforcement agencies. I'm just going to click through these because I'm going to give you this as an assignment. I know we are all very familiar with our police, our popular police agencies. If I said name a federal police agency, the response might be what? The FBI, right? Secret Service. We're familiar with those. The federal government, they exist in various departments and agencies, and they are tasked with different types of investigation and jobs. They have unlimited terrain or jurisdiction, as they call it, so they can go anywhere in the country, and they have no really particular rank and order of hierarchy. One of the assignments it's going to be is I'm going to talk generally about the federal, state, and other police agencies, but there's a supplemental material in the assignment that has a full-length discussion on the various types of agencies within the federal system, within the state system, and so on down. So you can have a look at all of these particular jobs that are deemed law enforcement jobs that you may or may not be aware of. So I'm going to have you pick one, dump it into our database that's up on Moodle so we can get a nice list, and everybody can look at the different law enforcement jobs that are out there. And there's more specific instructions in the assignment, but for this I'm going to be very general when we talk about it. The states have their police department, right? New York, if we're in New York, we have the New York State Troopers. They address rural crime and provide assistance to local agencies. They're also limited to state highways for patrolling. They have a lot of resources. There's their training academies. They provide emergency medical services. They investigate crime scenes. They have a big role, and yes, they have a role on war on terror. I will say that their role, at least in New York, they're very involved in the quote-unquote war on drugs. We have an Adirondack task force that is made up of the troopers, the county, the city police, and the FBI that investigates drug crimes here in the North Country and near the border. So the New York state law enforcement agencies or state law enforcement agencies have a lot of ground that they cover. And then we have the county sheriff. Like I said earlier, their position evolved over time. They have jurisdiction over the county that they are elected to be in. They usually run and oversee the county jail as well. And they also play a role in any sort of increasing area, i.e. war on terror or a war on drugs. In New York, there was guns when the governor passed the New York State SAFE Act regarding guns. There was a group of the law enforcement, a member of each law enforcement group in the area that came together and enforced those new laws. Technology, obviously the concerns, budgets is always a concern. I told you one of the, I think, first chapters is a $200 billion business, right? The criminal justice system. The money comes from somewhere, federal, state aid, local aid, but there's always budget realities, and they make the most of what they got. As technology gets better, it also increases for cost to do those, but it also is very helpful in solving crimes and investigating crimes. We have all sorts of fun technology that law enforcement agents use. Right now we have all sorts of forensics. There's DNA profiling. They can do crime mapping. They use social media and networking. We follow people. They get online. They found predators on Craigslist. There's all sorts of programs that they can use. We'll talk more about those as we delve into the police and their investigating resources when we talk about that part of their position that they do. But there's tons of technology improvements that have grown the police department and their abilities to apprehend folks who commit crimes.